All right. Hope that you had a good New Year's Eve and that all is safe and well with you. And happy New Year to you. And hope that everything goes well for you in this new year. And hope that everything stabilizes for every one of us and COVID goes away eventually. And all those things, and we get back to some degree of normalcy. Uh, I'm going to cover history of ethics today. I'm not going to cover it all. I'm going to cover three people: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And we're going to try to get through all three of those today and do that in about 30 minutes, 30 to 35 minutes. So, once again, my office hours are on Tuesday and Thursday from 5 until 6. And then if you have any questions and you'd like to pop into my office hours via Zoom, the Zoom link is on the course website and you can pop in. I will admit you and you can ask any question that you might have. Then also, if you don't need to do that, you can email me and those kinds of things and forward me any questions that you have. And I'm glad to answer those. Midterm is coming up next week, and I will talk a little bit more about that probably on Monday and help you with regard to give you some direction with regard to preparing for the midterm. Um, uh, and I think that's pretty well all I have to say as far as administrative responsibilities. So now we'll move to the lecture and uh, let me pull up my PowerPoint slide. All right, slide. Okay, so we talked about why be moral, why be ethical yesterday. So now we come to history. Now, let me say something about this before we begin looking at the three individuals who constitute Greek, the ancient Greek ethics, constitute the core, the trilogy of individuals, the trinity of individuals that really stand out with regard to Greek ethics. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Greek ethics, the golden age of Greek ethics pertains to three individuals: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Those are the three biggies in ancient Greek ethics. Did ethics get addressed prior to those three individuals? Yes, indeed, it did. But the pinnacle of ethical thought and ethical dialogue occurred in Greece among those three individuals. So that's why Greek ethics, ancient Greek ethics, is so significant and so important. The three individuals that really are the trinity of ancient Greek ethics are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The relationship between those three individuals is as follows. Socrates was really kind of the the beginning of a great deal of profundity with regard to ethical thought. And Socrates taught Plato. Plato was one of Socrates' students, and we know this from Plato's dialogues or which are his writings. So Socrates was Plato's teacher. Plato was Socrates' student. And then Aristotle was Plato's student, and Plato was Aristotle's teacher. Those three individuals are all interrelated, and yet they all have their distinctive emphases and their own unique perspectives on ethics. But they're great minds and great individuals who have greatly influenced our culture, even in Western culture, even until today. So with that having been said, let's look at Socrates. Socrates was when you read when you read about Socrates, we don't have any writings of Socrates. We never have any evidence that Socrates ever wrote anything. The only way that we know what Socrates taught is evidenced in the writings of Plato, who was the student of Socrates. um, Plato wrote the dialogues, and in the early dialogues, his dialogues are divided into three portions. They're considered to be Plato's dialogues are divided into the early dialogues, divided into the middle dialogues, and also the later dialogues. The early dialogues are the earliest writings of Plato, and they're called dialogues because they really are presented in the form of a dialogue between two or three individuals. But that having been said, the earliest dialogues of Plato are those that were written in closest proximity to Plato's affiliation with Socrates. And so, as a result of that, most Platonic scholars and Socratic scholars conclude that the early dialogues of Plato reflect really Plato's knowledge gained from Socrates. Now, that becomes less and less the case in the middle dialogues and in the later dialogues. Plato seems to develop his own style and his own thought and his own approach. But Socrates never wrote anything. The only way we seem to know what Socrates taught is from the writings of Plato, specifically the early dialogues of Plato. Socrates was concerned primarily with man. He was not concerned with nature. And in philosophy, that is called metaphysics. Nature is metaphysics. Socrates, when you was evidently not primarily concerned with the ultimate nature of reality, which is metaphysics, but he was concerned with the nature of man. What is man's life like? What is man's life to be like? What is the good life? What is the moral life? What is the ethical life? Can everyone be ethical? Can anyone choose to be ethical? If we are unethical, can we choose to be ethical? So, what Socrates does is considers man from the perspective of his inner life. And Socrates' teachings really focus upon uh, uh, inward uh, or introspection, looking at one's own life, evaluating the way that one is living life, reflecting upon the way that one is living life. Socrates advocated, as the fourth bullet point on the slide says, that the beginning of the ethical life uh, begins with knowing oneself. That was Socrates' mantra: know thyself, know thyself. That phrase itself, know thyself, is a call to self reflection. We're living in a day and time when people really don't self reflect, they just act. We try to stay so busy, we try to stay so occupied, we try to stay so distracted that we don't reflect upon who we are, why we're making the decisions that we're making. And that's a real problem, especially with regard to reassessing or assessing or evaluating the way that a person is living life. Socrates would say to us that the moral life or the ethical life is a life that begins by knowing oneself. You have to go inside, you have to examine the cracks and the crevices of your life in order to determine what has shaped you, what is motivating your decisions, how you need to improve the quality of life that you're living. And that all begins with knowing yourself. You cannot, Socrates says, change the trajectory or the direction of your life unless you come to grips with who you are, what has shaped you into who you are, and why you are living the life that you're living, and how do you need to change. So the next bullet point says Socrates calls for reflection, for criticism, and for ethical maturity. He calls for self-criticism, not the criticism necessarily of others, but the criticism of self, evaluating of self, reflecting upon self, how you are living life. Um, Next bullet point says that the core of Socrates' ethic is summed up in the Greek word arete, A-R-E-T-E-E. The word means virtue. Socrates was concerned with the ethical life, a person living a moral life, an ethical life. But for him, the moral or the ethical life consists of living a life of virtue or of arete. And so many of Socrates' writings are concerned, not Socrates' writings, Socrates' teachings are concerned with the question of what is virtue? Is one a virtuous person? Is one a good person? If one is not a virtuous person, can one learn to be a virtuous person? In other words, can someone change the trajectory or the direction of their life? And obviously, that begins with knowing oneself. So Socrates is concerned with virtue. Socrates even goes so far as to say that virtue is that for which man was born. Man was born and destined to be virtuous. And when we are not virtuous, when we are not ethical, when we are not good people, when we're not engaging in good deeds, then therefore we are departing from the original intent for our very being or the very basis of our existence as human beings. Now, let's bring those two phrases together: virtue, arete, and knowing yourself. Uh, Socrates advocated that the beginning of virtue is knowledge of oneself. Thus, his phrase, know thyself. If we want to be virtuous people, then we have to reflect upon our lives and contemplate our lives and criticize the way that we're living life and the kind of persons that we are, and then make a deliberate effort to change. Another thing about virtue is Socrates advocated that virtue can be taught. That while virtue is a part of our destiny and what we're meant to be, if we're not virtuous people, if we're not acting in virtuous ways, then virtue can be taught. It's not necessarily something that we either have or don't have. It can be taught or it can be learned by an individual. So for Socrates to say, well, I was just born this way, or my circumstances shaped me into the person that I am, and I am forever enslaved into being the kind of person that I am. For Socrates, that was a cop out, because virtue can be taught if we will submit ourselves to the right teachings, the right teachers, and virtue can be learned. So we can redirect our lives. Socrates refused to allow us to cop out, so to speak, and say, well, I am what I am, and that's not going to change. So Socrates laid the foundation for Plato and Aristotle with his teachings with regard to the issue of virtue. And again, he never wrote anything, and the only way that we're familiar with Socrates' teachings is through the work of, of Plato, specifically his his early Platonic dialogues. So that's a little bit regarding Socrates. Socrates was in Greek society known for being an instigator of troubles. He was a challenger of the status quo. He had a group of disciples that followed him around, a group of students that followed him around Greece, and eventually, the Greek authorities, the governmental leaders in Greece, determined that Socrates was promoting insurrection and rebellion and anti-authoritarianism against the government. They accused him of corrupting the youth of Greece with his teachings and with his anti-authoritarian spirit, with his challenging mentality. And they put him on trial. It's known as the trial of Socrates. As a result of having been put on trial, he was sentenced to death. And the way that he was sentenced to death was he was placed under house arrest. People could come and visit him and interact with him. His former students could come and interact with him. But at a given time, he was supposed to self-administer uh, poison. I cannot recall the name of the poison at this time, but he was to self-administer poison and to kill himself. So and so eventually he did die of he was put to death, and by self-infliction of the poison hemlock. The hemlock. There's a hemlock society today, and hemlock was what um, hemlock society is for physician assisted for is for the right to commit suicide, or the right to take one's own life if you are sick enough, or if you're not going to recover. The Hemlock Society advocates that that should be a right, and that name hemlock comes from the poison which Socrates administered to himself and resulted in the taking of his own life. But he was compelled to do that by the Greek authorities. He didn't do that of his own volition. He was sentenced to death by the Greek authorities. Um, Interesting thing about Socrates is while he was under house arrest, some of his students came to him and said to him that they would help him escape if he wanted to do so. And Socrates refused to escape. He said, "No, I will not leave because I have enjoyed the benefits of Greek government and Greek society. It's been a good thing for me. It's been a good thing for my family. It's been a good thing for me to be able to conduct my teaching here in Greece. And if I live with the benefits of the society, then I also have to live with the detriments of society." And he still respected Greek government to the point that he carried out their death sentence as they instructed him to do. So he refused to escape because he had enjoyed the benefits of the society and Greek government. So that's a lesson in and of itself with regard to our own lives and the kind of virtuous people that Socrates would have expected us to be. So that's Socrates. Plato is somewhat different from Socrates. Plato was very angry with the Greek authorities because of their sentencing of his great teacher Socrates to death, and Plato really had a chip on his shoulder with regard to the Greek authorities, and he thought that the Greek authorities were very ignorant and that they were not very intelligent, and that any society, as a result, or any government should be run by what he called the philosopher kings. That the philosophers were really the only ones who were smart enough, or sharp enough, or intellectual enough, or virtuous enough in order to conduct governmental responsibilities and to maintain an orderly society. So Plato advocated the concept of the philosopher king. Obviously, we don't have philosopher kings today. Some people propose that the Supreme Court is as close as our nation gets to philosopher kings, the judges on the Supreme Court, kind of the philosopher kings. I think there's some validity to that, but ultimately they are not in they're in control of the legal considerations, but they're not really exactly what Plato was referring to when he spoke of philosopher kings. So with regard to Plato and truth, let's talk about Plato and truth. That's really where Plato begins to kind of flesh out his own distinctive approach to this thing of ethics and morality. For Plato, truth is universal. For Plato, truth is eternal, and for Plato, truth is rationally comprehensible. So, first of all, truth is universal. He's really, Plato is an objective ethical uh, advocated a theory of objective ethics. Truth and right and wrong and ethical and unethical, those things are universal for Plato. They are not contingent upon the individual, they are universal. And we are to conform ourselves to a universal standards. Secondly, they are eternal in that they apply to all people of all times, of all eras, of all ages. They are eternal. So it's not like ethics and morality and truth change from generation to generation. Plato advocates that what is always right, has always been right, and will always be right. What is wrong, it has always been wrong, and will always be wrong. And you can substitute the words ethical and unethical for right and wrong in those instances. So Plato says that truth, or even ethical truth, standards of right and wrong, are universal and they are eternal. And then number three, that they are rationally comprehensible. Now, what does that mean? That means this, that if we will pause long enough to reflect upon serious intellectual engagement and rational inspection, rational thinking, really wanting to know of the truth or what right and wrong is. If we will put our brains into it, Plato says we can know right and wrong. We can figure it out. It's not a guess. It's not an intuition. It's not an assumption. Plato says that the knowledge of right and wrong is rationally comprehensible. We can understand it and grasp it if we will seriously engage in rational reflection upon what is right and wrong, do our research and think things through. So I'm going to leave the rest of that slide to you to look at, but I want to move down to the virtues on that slide, virtues that are required according to Plato. Well, Plato advocated virtues and did not and condemned vices. So what are the virtues? Well, the virtues are things like courage and goodness and rightness and character and integrity and those kinds of things. All right. So those are the good qualities of life that we should pursue in life: courage, insight, intelligence, moderation, etc. But then the vices include things like excess, indulgence, cowardice, foolishness. Those are negative things. So in the Greek writers, they had what were called, and Plato has these, virtue lists and vice lists, lists, lists. Virtue list, a listing of virtues that we should pursue in life, and listings of vices that we should avoid in life. Plato says that the reason we should avoid the vices is because they lead to what he called the chaos of the soul. When we commit ourselves to various vices, such as overindulgence with regard to sex, or with regard to alcohol, or with regard to drugs, or with regard to any kind of selfish pursuit, then that leads to chaos of the soul. In other words, it just leads to a chaotic personality, a chaotic existence. It's a miserable existence. And yet we can become very comfortable in that existence after prolonged periods of time, and think that's really the quality of life that we are destined to live. But Plato, like Socrates, advocates that we are we are intended to live better lives than lives of chaos. So you look around at people's lives, and maybe if you look at your own life, and if you see in some area chaos of the soul, chaos of the soul, you're unhappy, you're miserable. Plato would say, well, that's maybe because you're giving yourself over to the vices in some area of your life. So Plato was very much about harmony of the soul and peaceableness of the soul and balance of the soul, and having a balance between the brain, the heart, and the appetite, and having balance, a balanced life. And Plato goes so far as to say that if we as individuals have balanced lives, then society will be balanced and the institutions around us will be more balanced. That plays itself out in family life. A chaotic personality leads to a chaotic family. A person with a balanced life has a balance in their family life. So Plato, like Socrates, is very insistent that this thing of ethics and morality and peace in life and fulfillment in life begins with the individual. That if we will just so arrange ourselves uh, in an orderly fashion with regard to who we are, and we will start living balanced lives, well rounded lives, then those institutions around us, even the family itself, will be. Will be much more well balanced and much more harmonious. So he really is highly individualistic. And then the last bullet point on the page says that Plato, that individuals and society are to be governed by reason and not passion. Plato emphasizes reason. He emphasizes rationality. He emphasizes thinking. He emphasizes thought, not the passions. Sub animals are driven by the passions. Less than human beings are are driven by the passions. As human beings, we are supposed to be driven by rationality and by reasonableness and by thoughtfulness and self-reflection and self-contemplation and those kinds of things. So we're not to give our lives over to the passions that would tend to dominate us. So Plato really builds upon Socrates, and there's some degree of similarity between the two. But the longer Plato goes on, the more he develops his own approach to ethics and these kinds of things. All right, so now then let's talk about the third individual, and that is Aristotle. Aristotle probably had the greatest influence on Western ethical thought. Aristotle, out of the three individuals we're looking at, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, Aristotle was probably one of the more, I'm reluctant to say it, but maybe he was the more brilliant of all three. Aristotle really kind of provides the basis for the scientific worldview. Now, I don't endorse the scientific worldview 100%, but Aristotle does indeed provide the basis for the scientific worldview. He was a pupil of Plato, but he differed from Plato on many points. So let's talk about those a little bit. Plato says that morality is to be governed by universal ideals. That's what I was getting at a moment ago when I said that Plato says that that morality is universal and it's absolute, it's eternal, it applies to all people of all ages, or all eras, or all epochs, and that it is rationally comprehensible. So morality for Plato was governed by universal ideals that are kind of built into the cosmos and built into the universe, that we know because our soul came from the world of forms that we'll talk about later on in a subsequent lecture. So Plato said that that morality is universal. Aristotle taught that morality was to be governed by consequences. So let me say that in a different way. Plato, with regard to morality, was a non-consequentialist. He did not care about the consequences of our moral actions. He was only concerned with rationally comprehending what is right or wrong. But Aristotle talked about consequences of moral actions. He says, we determine what is right and wrong based upon consequences. He was a consequentialist. Plato was a non-consequentialist. Aristotle was a consequentialist because he recognized the role of consequences. Plato was a non-consequentialist because he did not care about the consequences of our moral decisions. What is right, what is wrong, regardless of what the consequences might be. Aristotle provides the basis for the conclusion that if we make a moral decision and it produces good consequences, then that moral decision was a good decision. However, if we make a moral decision and that moral decision is a bad decision or has bad consequences, then it was a bad decision. So the consequences for Aristotle seem to shape the nature of the moral decision that we're making. So the moral decision that we're making is not inherently right or wrong, moral or immoral, ethical or unethical. It's not inherently any of those things. The nature of the moral action is determined by the nature of the consequences that the moral action produces. If the moral action produces good consequences, then it was a good moral decision. If the moral decision produces bad consequences, then it was a bad moral decision. So there is a major difference between Plato and Aristotle. Plato says it makes no difference with regard to what the outcome of the moral decision is. You still keep the moral decision, you still make the moral decision that is right, and that the moral decision is right inherently or in and of itself. But Aristotle says no, not so. It's the consequences that make the decision right or wrong, ethical or unethical, moral or immoral. Um, so let's just say we're confronted with a moral decision with regard to maybe our spouse. And we have to make a decision. So we make a decision and it produces good consequences. Then uh, Aristotle says that was a good moral decision. But if we make a decision and it produces bad consequences, then Aristotle says that was a bad moral decision. So the point of all that is this, that the consequences shape the nature of the decision that we're making, the moral decision that we're making. It is not inherently right and wrong. It's right and wrong on the basis of the outcome or the results or the consequences of the decision that we have made. All right. So then also Aristotle advocated what is called the golden means. This somewhat resembles Plato in that Aristotle called for balance. You know, in the last section we talked about Plato saying that we do not want chaos of the soul. That's Plato's way of saying we want balance of the soul. We don't want imbalance in the soul. We want to live a balanced, well-rounded life. uh, Aristotle is kind of getting at that here with regard to the golden means. What does he mean by the golden means? Well, the means is an average. Means is an average. For example, Aristotle says that we all have virtues in our life. Let's just take, or we all have there. We all know that there are virtues that we are to pursue in our life. For example, there's the virtue of courage. So let's just consider for the brief moment courage, the virtue of courage. Aristotle says that we should have courage in our lives, but he says that we should have courage in the right proportion. So that's what he means by means, the golden means. We should have the average amount of courage. We should have the right amount of courage. We should have courage in balance. For example, he would say we can't have an excess of courage. Too much courage leads to foolhardiness, to overconfidence, and to excessive boldness. We make stupid decisions and do stupid things whenever we have too much courage. We bite off more than we can chew, to put it in common day vernacular. So we don't want courage in the excess, but we also don't want courage in the as a deficient amount of courage in our lives. That's the other extreme. A deficiency in courage means that we are cowards, or that we lack boldness, or that we lack confidence. So Aristotle says we're constantly striving to balance these virtues in our lives, whether they are, regardless of what they are. Uh, uh, and that's on the slide in front of you. We're the moral life, for Aristotle says, the moral life exists between extremes of excess and deficiency. With regard to courage, excess of courage is foolhardiness. Deficiency of courage is cowardliness. And so we want courage in just the right amount. We want to maintain a balance. For example, if in studying for the exam next week in Dr. Carter's class, you want courage, but you don't want too much courage, because too much courage give you overconfidence and foolhardiness, and you'll fail the exam, or you will not do well on the exam. But on the other hand, you don't want a deficiency of courage, because a deficiency of courage means a lack of confidence. And that's just as detrimental and can be just as devastating as too much courage, because you won't perform well on the exam. So you need to study, you need to prepare, you need to work at it in all of your courses as you approach the exam. Don't have too much courage, don't have too little confidence or courage. Pursue it just the right amount, have balance, and strive to do well on the exam. And that's true of any task in life, with regard to a job, with regard to a responsibility that's entrusted to us. It's true across the board. So that's kind of Aristotle. And so the takeaway from all this, if I can kind of summarize Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, Socrates emphasized virtue, being a virtuous individual. He emphasized that being a virtuous individual is something that can be learned. Plato emphasized the universality of truth, and that what is right and wrong is right and wrong across the board. It's always been so and will always be so. Aristotle emphasized the consequences of the moral decisions that we make. And so we evaluate the rightness or wrongness of those decisions based upon the kind of consequences that it produced. Aristotle also emphasized balance in his idea of the golden means. And I illustrated that with regard to the virtue of courage. You can't have too little or too much courage, because both of those are detrimental. Now then, you have in this lecture today more than enough information to answer the first forum question. So don't just give me a cursory treatment of these. Don't just give me one sentence for Plato, one sentence for Aristotle, and one sentence for Socrates. It asks for you to compare and to contrast those three individuals. So compare means to show where they are the same. How are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle the same? So you need to discuss similarities between those individuals. And you can have these slides in front of you, and the notes that you've taken from this lecture, you can have those in front of you when you're writing. There's no excuse for halfway doing this forum discussion. So you'll want to discuss similarities, that's to compare. And then you'll want to discuss differences, that's the contrast. Contrast, how is Socrates different from Plato? How is Plato different from Socrates? How is Plato and how are Aristotle and Plato similar? How are they different? So you'll want to do both of those things, compare and contrast, and give me ample information to demonstrate to me that you actually understand how these three individuals were similar and how they were different. So now you have plenty of information to be able to go online and answer the first forum question. And you should be able to answer the first quiz as well. So anyhow, with that having been said, I hope that you have a great weekend. Hope that you're staying up on classwork. Don't get behind. I will not be very sympathetic if you get behind at the end and ask for me to reopen something. You need to be taking care of business and be disciplined in the process. So have a great weekend, be safe, and I will see you on Monday, and we will move on to the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Skeptics as we continue our discussion of ethical history. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.